gentlemen, hello and welcome. I'm going to start by thanking Iranian-American Community Center in Parks Place for hosting and bringing us together. I want to also thank our amazing author for coming here and giving us her time, and all of you for spending your afternoon on such a gorgeous, beautiful day with us. So I really, really appreciate it. You know, when Parks Place was thought of many years ago, this is really the type of event that we were hoping that we can have, and how we could bring not just our community together, but also share. And I also want to give a shout out to another author amongst us, Termeh, who has promised me, we ended up doing a virtual talk, and has promised me that he's going to do another book so we could do it in person. So, but bringing us to the conversation at hand. Thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank
Yeah.
you for having me. Thank you.
So, you know, what I want to do is, what I thought we could do is start talking about a little bit about you and getting to know you a little bit for those in the audience that maybe doesn't know you as well. And we will be speaking in English, just a side note, but if anybody has any questions and they feel more comfortable in Farsi at the end, feel free, and you know, we'll respond in that way. But you know, what I thought we could do is get to know you a little bit, then we can talk about this amazing book, and then start, you know, exploring what it's like to craft such a beautiful narrative that's so closely tied to one's identity and can refer us back. So you're one of the first generation that is truly Iranian-American.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I would love to kind of understand a little bit about, because you went to Iran, you came back here. What is the thing that you think back, what is the thing that you remember the most about, like, your time in Iran? What is the place that whenever you say Iran, you think of that place?
My grandparents' house.
Okay.
When I was a child, they lived downtown, and then they moved to Shemran, and when we visited Iran, we lived with them, and we had our own sort of suite of rooms, I guess, and they were very religious. And so we also had different sets of rules for downstairs where they were and upstairs where we were.
Okay.
And I'm sure they knew that we had different rules in our section of the house, but they never said anything. So, but yeah, that's what I remember the most. Living with them, the household, khanevade, you know, and all the people who lived there. Yeah.
And when you went back, was that the first time that your mom had come back to Iran?
So my mom was American, and she had me, and when I was 6 months old, she and my father and I went to Iran for the first time, and that was 1957. And then we just went back and forth until I was about 21 years old.
The reason I find that really interesting is, you know, as we start talking about the book, there's so much about identity and role of woman, and I'm fascinated by the fact that, you know, a formative person and someone that you actually refer to at the end of your book, your mom came from such a different culture, and then for her to experience that, and we'll get into.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that, because she probably was more compliant as an Iranian woman, or what she thought an Iranian woman should be, than most Iranian women I know. So, and I think that was because she was American. She tried to adapt and be, you know, and so she was even more compliant, sadly. So.
That's pretty amazing. You moved back to the U.S. Around the revolution, right before the revolution. You moved here, and you know, your parents thankfully were with you. You started kind of the life here. What made you decide to go into kind of the field and write and kind of choose that? Because that's not something that you would think normally is encouraged.
It was not encouraged. There's no one else in my family who is a writer by trade. It took me a while to figure out that that's what I wanted to do. And, you know, we were a very business oriented family and still are. And I don't know how it happened. You know, I think if I had had writers in my family or close friends who are writers or mentors in that field, I may have known earlier. But the revolution helped me to understand. First, I went into journalism and I got my degree in journalism. That was right after or soon after the revolution. And I was a terrible journalist.
Why do you say that?
Because I wanted to make things up.
Yes. Well, you would have finished so well now. Exactly.
I know, these days I would be perfect.
You were a couple of decades early.
Yeah, So, and I also, my perception of things is to look at details that not everybody sees. It's just a natural way that I look at things. So if I had to, as a journalist, if I had to report on a story, let's say it was a murder or something, or a fire, you know, I would report on what clothes the person was wearing rather than, you know, or what was in her apartment rather than, you know, okay, she had 15 knife wounds or something like that. So I just, yeah, and from childhood, I was a dreamer. So I could, and you can ask my brother, he's here, although he's much younger than I am. But everybody, and my cousin is here, she'll know this. Where was I during the day, in the summer, in Tehran? I was lying in my bed, reading, or just staring at the ceiling and listening to music. It just was natural for me the most interesting thing for me to do was to make up stories in my head with dialogue and revisions.
Mm-hmm.
It just was a natural thing. I didn't relate it to writing until much later. So I really didn't start writing fiction until I was in my mid-20s.
What were you reading in those days?
So since nobody in my family was really literary, I mean, they were literate, but they were not literary. Although my grandmother was illiterate. The books they were recommending were, you know, bestsellers and, you know, not literary works.
Okay.
Those I got probably in school.
Okay.
And I had some really good English teachers and then I was very into Russian literature. And I think that Russian literature really influences my writing. So, you know, especially Tolstoy, because he writes about family all the time, and so do I. So I think that those were the influences that were most. But I mean, I went through a romance period. I just, you know, paperbacks one after the other. I mean, when I was in my teens, and, you know, just read anything and everything.
Oh my God, where's my sister? She makes fun of me for that phase
Oh,
of
no.
my life. I'm like, wait,
No,
yes,
no.
no, I love that.
No.
And it's interesting you say that because I think Russian authors, especially for those who grew up in Iran around that time, were so big. And I remember Anna Karenina being like,
right,
you know, so
right.
I appreciate the story and the detail.
Thank you.
In that and the way that shows in your book. So this isn't your first book about this experience, and you wrote your first book at a time where this genre was not very popular. So, you know, if we kind of think back, you published in 1997. I'm wondering how that experience differed from this experience.
It differed in some ways, and in other ways it didn't.
Okay.
So that there's still this idea in, you know, the publishing industry that a publishing house will say, oh, we already have an Iranian-American writer, so we don't need to have more than one. And that is really gross, disgusting, quite frankly, but there's nothing you can do about it except get more readers. So the more books you sell, the more Iranian-American writers they will publish. It's the same for any minority group, because the publishing industry is more interested in making money than in anything else. So the first time around, first of all, it was just, it came out in the fall, which is when all the big books come out. It was about the Iranian Revolution, and it was still a time right before 9/11 when, Iran, as it does still, elicits this sort of visceral response from a lot of the American population because it's been demonized. And so it was hard to get it out there to people. So it did not do very well. And that was really hard for me. And then every book and then of course Khaled Hosseini came out with his book, and it was a smash hit. But of course that was because America was in that place of rescuing Afghanistan. I'm sure if you wrote it today, it probably wouldn't become a smash hit. So it is the population, the reader's population, that makes the difference, I think. In this case, first of all, I insisted that it be a paperback original because I think hardbacks are too expensive, and I want as many readers as possible, because that's really what the essence of it is to get people to engage and understand. And I wanted it to reach a lot of immigrants and their American-born children. I don't think this is just an Iranian-American story. I think it's a very universal story.
I agree, and I think one of the things that you said that I just want to touch on, I find fascinating, is in a lot of the books that you read, first of all, we don't have that many fiction books. It's a lot of kind of story of becoming an American, an Iranian-American, that whole thing. But the other point is Iran is such a central character. It almost like sucks the air out of the room or out of the novel in terms of being able to kind of connect the different characters and being able to build the foundation of the fiction book. And I thought that was really interesting because it's there, but it's not the central.
Well, yeah, because the last time I saw Iran was 1978. And in fact, when I was writing this book, I did write a whole section that takes place in Iran. There are some characters who go back after 40 years, they go back to Iran, and they are stunned by how different it is in their eyes. And I wrote those chapters, but I ultimately didn't put them in the book because I just couldn't. I felt that it was false. I had an experience, no matter how many movies I watched, I could not really identify with the Iran of today. And so, but Iran itself and the political situation there and the societal situation is very much present.
Sorry, Siri would like to say
I love it. I'm so glad it wasn't me.
No, I think, we were thinking ChatGPT, can it just like take over the interview, so, yeah.
ChatGPT is actually pretty phenomenal, I have to say. But yeah, so
we're talking about the authenticity of not having been to Iran.
Right. So, and for me, Iran is such a big presence in my life, even though my mother was American. I mean, my mother was an only child. So when she married my dad with his 6 brothers and, this huge family in Iran, and then after the revolution, even before the revolution, all of them coming here to visit, she really became part of, the Iranian sort of diaspora. And so, so did we. So that was the identifying factor. And then when the revolution happened, I felt terrible because I lived a life until I was 20 where my Iranian side and my American side were completely bifurcated. I mean, they just did not mix. And even though I did that, the Iranian, when I would go to Iran, I was the American girl, and when I was in America, I was the Iranian girl. So coming to terms with being an outsider is what was my sort of lifelong, and I think in this book it's reflected, who are you? And is it okay to be an outsider? In fact, maybe it's better in some ways to be always a little bit outside so you can see really what is happening in the world around you.
Speaking of kind of some of the characters, so in this book, we meet this very, I would say, what we would consider modernized and modern woman that is, looking back and as a part of that, ends up questioning her, I would say questions her identity, and it's about the roles and expectations that were given. And so what I would love to do is maybe, I want to ask how many of you have not had a chance to read the book? Okay, so we're going to spend a little bit of time sharing, kind of the high level story, and then we'll do a deep dive. So I was hoping if you would like to just kind of give us a overview of synopsis of.
Okay, so this is the story of a large, extended Iranian family living in the United States in New Jersey. The central characters are the nuclear family that has lived here for many years, since the 50s, and there's a wife and a husband, and they're both from Iran, and they have 2 daughters who were born here in the United States. And these 2 daughters rebel against a lot of the traditions that their parents are very tied to, and they do it in completely different ways. One is very outwardly rebellious, and the other one has more of a soft rebellion. But it's about this family that has absorbed a whole extended family from Iran. So it was just them here, and then the revolution happened, and everybody came here, and the father of this nuclear family becomes basically the patriarch of this extended family, when he never thought he would become that. And he really does take on the role and luxuriate in it until he realizes the damage that such things can do.
So Yusef, the father, so we have, what I found about him that was really interesting is that, to me, he in some ways was the most bifurcated character in the book in terms of his different identities that he had. And in some ways, I may be projecting, but I felt like it was that extreme belief in tradition, while at the same time being extremely westernized, which in a way to me is representative of Iranian identity back then, maybe in the 70s. I can't speak to it today, but back then.
Right.
So even though he's not necessarily a very likable character, he's very representative in a lot of ways. Was that intentional?
So. Yeah, I mean, I worry about the word representative because, it's used so often in identity politics where, or even, in identity politics when it comes to publishing novels, where they say, well, if you're not from a certain culture or race, you shouldn't be writing about that culture or that race, and you have to be sure that you're represented. But, that's sort of like when one editor or one agent said to me when she first read the book, well, we can shorten this book. There are 2 young Iranian refugees in the book. And she said to me, well, 1 refugee is enough. don't you think? And I'm like, well, you think one American is enough? You know, it's a
Yeah.
broad spectrum.
Yeah.
I can't claim to be representing all Iranian-American men of Yusuf's age,
True.
right?
Right.
But yes, he is a type. And one thing I think is true of him is what I have discovered in all immigrants, not just Iranian ones. They leave the old country, they come here, no matter how long they stay here, the old country remains the old country in their mind when they left it. And a lot of what I wanted to examine in this story was, how do you get to the point where you actually realize and say to yourself, that's not really my country anymore? Yes, I am tied politically, I'm tied emotionally, I'm tied historically, but I don't know really what's going on there. Instead of holding on to traditions that maybe no longer exist in the old country. I remember one time, I was in my teens, I was about 18 or something, and my uncle from Tehran came to visit us. And he came downstairs in the morning, this was at my parents' house, and my dad then came down, and I was smoking a cigarette, and I immediately put the cigarette out, right? And my uncle looked at me and he was like, what are you doing? And I was like, and he started to laugh. And he looked at my dad and he's like, Baba, where are you from? What century are you from? Let her smoke in front of you. All my kids, she smokes in front of me. And my dad, who's been living in America for 25 years, was, very chagrined. It was his older brother. And so, I mean, that's an example.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. So, when we meet these characters, Mitra is coming back for the 1 year, of her sister passing. Of Mitra and Anahita is the younger sister, Anna, and that, without giving too much away, ends up evoking a lot of conflicts and emotions in the family. But the other thing that happens is that it forces her to face some things that she had walked away from. And there's this thing I want to, and I don't remember where I picked this up, but it's about you and about what you wrote. So, yeah, so it's good. It's really good. It's sinister enemies within the private sanctity of home life.
Ooh.
Right?
Who wrote that?
I'll find it.
Okay.
But yeah. I thought that was like a really interesting way of talking about the fact that this is a story about where you're safe and where you can be yourself, and and little rebellions, not just by these two sisters, but all along the way. And it was interesting because in our culture, there's such a focus on everything was inside the house is
and
positive. Yeah.
That's the metaphor of the anda. So Mitra, the main character, is an architect. Well, she studies to be an architect, and then she can't finish because I can read the prologue or the beginning thing, so you'll get a sense of, she commits a very, very serious act of rebellion at the very start of the book. And this sets off an estrangement between her and her father. And she leaves, goes to San Francisco, and lives there for 17 years. And then her sister, who she's very close to, is killed in a car accident. And she comes back for the Saud for the 1 year, and they're still estranged. And then she learns a whole bunch of secrets about her sister and her family, and it's about really reconciling all of those things.
And Irony.
So she's an architect, and she she of course is informed by Persian architecture. And Persian architecture, the Andaruni and the Biruni, the women's quarters inside the house, the men's quarters outside the house. And my father can still remember the Andaruni, so, well, he's pretty old, but, that's where you were safe, inside. And then it's also how Iranian culture is. I mean, all cultures are like this. There's a veneer, what we present to people and what goes on inside the house. But in Iranian culture, it's extremely strict.
It's a very thick veneer.
Very thick.
Yes, yes, yes.
So it's always a question of, well, is this something I can show to the outside, or do I have to keep this secret? And a lot of it is silencing by the culture, just like the journalists are silenced, the writers are silenced by the regime. So the family in its patriarchy then becomes like the regime in its patriarchy.
That's beautifully said. I'm gonna ask you,
Yeah.
we talked about this. I said, what is the, piece that you wrote that you read and you're like, oh, that was good. So, so I asked and I said, can you please read one of your favorite,
Oh my gosh.
yeah, sections?
I'll just read the first. So, this is interesting for Iranians especially. At the very end of working on this book, at the process, which took 10 years, what came to me was somehow a way of creating these sort of very short, what I call interludes that tie the book together. And they came to me very mysteriously because they don't sound like the rest of the book. They're very poetic and lyrical. And I'm not a poet, and I don't speak Farsi very well. I don't read or write it. But if you're Iranian, no matter where you go, what party, somebody is going to start reciting, right? And it's beautiful, even if you don't understand what the hell they're saying. So
shake your head. Like,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So for some reason, these 7 interludes came to me, and I'll read you the first one. And then I'll read you the first sentence of the prologue, so you'll get an idea of what it sounds like. So the first one is called Sisters. In the time of our history, when the songwriter who imagined was murdered in New York and the dictator Saddam invaded Iran, there was a girl who wanted to be free as a boy in choosing her future. Her father, however, cared only that she marry a suitable young man. Her mother wanted peace all around. Despite his relentless nagging, the daughter refused an audience to any suitors who inquired. Soon it came to pass that the girl's younger sister, who was demure and obedient, and to whom the elder sister was supremely devoted, fell in love with a suitable young man of her own and wanted to marry. The father, recognizing this as an auspicious opportunity, pronounced that he would allow the marriage of his younger daughter only when the elder daughter consented to marry as well. Much to everyone's surprise, the elder daughter swiftly and dispassionately chose the next suitor in line. With great aplomb, the father sent invitations far and wide for a grand double wedding, at which point the elder daughter secretly visited a surgeon and had herself made barren, and therefore unmarriageable. The father, apoplectic with rage and determined not to lose face entirely, allowed the younger daughter to marry, but he disowned the elder one, who happily moved far away to pursue her desires. And then the prologue, the first sentence is, as a matter of coincidence, the American embassy hostages were released on the same day that Mitra Jahani had her tubes tied, January 20th, 1981.
Yeah, getting goosebumps having you read it.
No.
I think, and I don't know if you realize this, but it does. It's very. These interludes are very lyrical, as you pointed out. It almost sounds like Yeki Bud Yeki Nabud.
Oh,
like
I
as
know,
you're saying it.
Yeah.
So I, and it sets the stage and gives us some background information about each of the characters as they go along. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the main characters, and I'm torn because I want to talk about some of the plot lines, but I don't want to ruin it for
Don't worry,
those.
I'm so used to avoiding spoilers.
Okay.
So yeah, because now the book just came out, so I know what I can and can't. I've been having to do this for a while. I actually had my first book club meeting last week, and everyone had read the book, and it was such a weird conversation because I could reveal everything, and they were out, and I was like, "Oh, you know that already?" So it was, yeah.
So Mitra comes back, and in the process of her coming back, she ends up meeting someone who is very important to her sister. And that individual reveals certain things about her sister. And what was really interesting is that, you feel like Mitra, you start out thinking Mitra is the only one with the secrets. And then as you go along the book, you learn that there's everybody
has a secret. And that's true with every family, right?
With a little bit lower stakes
Yeah.
secrets than they do, yes, but yes.
Yeah.
And one of the characters that you meet very early on that is so familiar to those of us that I think grew up in Iran is Olga.
And she's the only character who's based on a real person.
I think Asya was so I would love for her to share, for you to share a little bit about her.
So Asya Lavai, who was, we called her Sada, she came to us in 1970, I think. And actually the book started off as sort of a pain to her, a song to her, because she eventually went back to Iran, and we couldn't see each other for the last 20 years of her life. And so I wanted to write her story, and she came to us as a nanny, cook, servant, but in Iranian households, those people become part of the family. And she was unusual because she was educated, spoke 5 languages, was from a middle-class family. Her mother had escaped the Bolsheviks in 1917 across the Caspian, and she was from Mazandaran, and she'd been married when she was very young and had a child, and the child was stillborn, and because of that she was not able to have more children. She'd been divorced, remarried, divorced, and she came to America to get away from her husband because she couldn't have children, and she felt bad for him. This was her second husband. She felt bad for him, and she wanted him to have a family. So she answered an ad in the paper to come to the US, and she came to us, and she figured that would be the best way for her to leave him and let him. So it's sort of parallel to the story with Mitra. And so in fact, she was a much larger part of the book before, in an older iteration. But, American publishers don't want as much of that in there. They wanted the story in the United States. And that was fine. So she is the one who influences, actually, I don't know if she influences Mitra or Mitra influences her. And I was very close to Sada, and we had very much a similar relationship as these two.
Which is really interesting because at the most important, in a lot of ways, she's more of a mom to Mitra in the book than Shirin, her own mom, right? Because she didn't feel, she was in the middle of any so her allegiance was to the girls. Yeah,
and I also wanted to explore this whole issue of motherhood because, for example, Sada was very, very close mothering-wise to my brother Cameron in this audience, because he was born right before she came to the States. And so he always considered her his other mother. And I do really honestly believe that in Iranian families or immigrant families that are extended, or American families, if they could get back to being more extended, there are many different figures, female figures in the family who are mothers. They don't have to have children. And that's the point I wanted to make with Mitra, that you can mother a child, and a child needs more than one mother, or needs different kinds of mothers to be involved, grandmothers to be involved in their life in order to mature. So I wanted that point to be made about the women in a family.
So one of the characters, there's a mother and daughter that are introduced a little bit, well, they're not introduced later in the book. They're introduced rather earlier, but you get to know them more towards the end. And this is a mother and daughter that have moved as refugees, political refugees, to the Bay Area, which is where Mitra is living. And they end up through kismet, coincidence, all of those things. She feels like, hey, I have an extra room in my house, I have a basement, why don't I help them out for a short period, what is supposed to be a short period of time. And I was just I found that also interesting in context of now, where we feel this need to help, but at the same time, the way that, I love I love the fact that, the mother ends up taking over in some ways, which is very intrusive to Mitra, and she's like, this is my space, and and it's like, glad that we come from the same land, but you need to,
definitely,
So I would love to hear a little bit, because you could have introduced the daughter without the mother. So I want to know kind of a little bit about why you made the decision to have the mother there.
I think because it's really important to me to emphasize something that I, learned during the course of writing this book, and that is the collusion of women in the patriarchal construct. And I'm not talking about just Iran, because the United States is also a patriarchal. We also live by the patriarchal structure here. Women, even me, I mean, any woman I know, we don't even realize we're doing it, but we participate within the family or in the workplace, whatever. We do things that lift men up, lift boys up at the expense of girls. And we may not realize we're doing it, but we are. And if we stop doing it, then the patriarchy cannot continue in a very strong way. And I think we're seeing that in Iran right now. So I wanted to show a woman, to have a character in there who was completely complicit in the patriarchal construct. She wants her daughter to wear hijab, she wants her daughter to get married soon, she wants her daughter to be a virgin, she wants her daughter to be very religious. She is not very literate, she comes from a village, and she thinks that Mitra and any of the other American or Iranian Americans are, whatever, najes, or not even najes, but just, godless. So I wanted to show that there are different kinds of participation in that.
I think that's silent, I want to call it silent menace. It's almost like, this subservient, but at the same time,
Aunt Lydia.
Right? No, it was just so interesting, because you could tell. I'm like, oh my God, is she gonna try to kill her? Right. She was so I found her to be a really interesting character, actually.
Yeah, I wanted to contrast her with and her daughter Salima with the other refugee, Zoya, later, who comes from, she's children of writers and intellectuals, and she's incredibly, well educated. She's a coder. She goes to the university. She comes to the United States, but she's a very different product of a very diverse society. And it makes me angry when Americans or Westerners think that Iran is like a sort of monolithic society. It's not. It's just as diverse as America or as any other place.
So interesting you brought that up, because I think a lot of people who moved here after the revolution for a really long time used different tools to try to distance and differentiate themselves from what was happening and what people saw. There's the, and I don't mean to get controversial, but there is the Iran versus Persia thing that is, comes up a lot. There is the, well, that's not us and that's not how we are, type of a conversation that ends up happening. And one of the things that really struck me when I was reading the book about the history, so Yusuf comes from a very traditional family, and he's the son of a minor wife who ends up, reminded me a little bit about Prince Philip, but ends up in a mental institution because she has seizures.
Epilepsy.
Epilepsy.
Yeah, and even in America in those days, epilepsy was considered a form of insanity. So
hysteria.
Yes. Hysteria.
The hysterics, yes.
Yeah.
But what I found, my reaction when I read that was that, right? This wanting to distance, because I think, I grew up in a very different type of a environment and family. And it made me realize that we're only 1 or 2 generations away from that traditional model of multiple wives, and that was a moment that I had to kind of check in with myself and my definition of where I come from. So I thought it was interesting, and I'm wondering if that was, again, something on purpose that you wanted to bring in, or is it this is just the way we are?
No, I mean, my books are character driven, so first I figure out who the characters are, and I do a deep dive into them, and then they sort of, I have an idea for a plot, but they sort of move the plot because everybody reacts to certain situations in a different way. I wouldn't say that, Yusuf's family was a type of family. They were Khans, my family was not, but my grandfather had a second wife and 2 children from that second wife. So, I don't know. I think that we're so diverse.
Yeah.
My husband's family, his great grandfather went to Paris and took a picture, on the Eiffel Tower. My grandfather or great grandfather was probably, I don't know, a farmer or a shepherd or something. So I just want very badly not for people to be afraid of not pigeonholing. We feel so compelled to categorize ourselves and to categorize the world because we want to make patterns so that we feel comfortable. But I think we have to embrace this lack of categorization and this broadness to ourselves and to society as far as identity is concerned. So I don't know. I wouldn't say that Yusuf's family that's who we are. No, that's who Yusuf's family was.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. You write with accent. So a couple of your characters have accents.
Yeah.
And it's very specific to the character.
I can't help it.
And so when I was reading it, I felt like a performer on stage, because I could hear Shirin's accent, I could hear Yusuf's accent, and I found that really interesting. And we'll ask later. I know.
Was it annoying?
No,
oh, okay.
No, it was interesting. In the beginning, I was like, why is this happening? Why is but then I realized that, did that come to you naturally? Or
so naturally,
okay.
I'll tell you. We do not, so my dad is 99, and we imitate him constantly. I mean, we have phrases, I mean, it's just, and all of us, down to the grandkids, we talk like him all the time. In front of him. I remember I was being interviewed in San Francisco, and my interviewer, who happened to be Amy Tan, before we went on stage, he was like, so, are we gonna talk in our parents' accents? And I said, yeah, her mom is passed away a long time ago, but my dad's alive, and he was watching it on Zoom. And so she was like, oh, then we can't do it. I was like, what do you mean we can't do it? She's like, well, we can't imitate him while you're, I'm like, hell yeah, we can.
What? I don't know what you're talking about. You may not think about this, but I'm gonna ask you, when you're writing, when you wrote this book, was it just the characters coming to you and you said it? Were you thinking about your audience? Were you thinking, am I writing this for an Iranian audience or someone that's familiar with the culture, or am I writing this for an American? Did that come into play?
I think with my first book it came into play more.
Okay.
Because there were fewer Iranians. I mean, now I have a whole new generation of Iranian-Americans who are going to be reading this, and they are more like me than any other audience, so I'm writing to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I wish I was 20 years younger so that I could be part of that community. Actually, I'm going to be part of that community. You know, because it was very lonely being who I was growing up, because there were just hardly any of us. Yeah. So yeah, I'm writing to them.
Okay.
I'm writing to the kids of immigrants who I know, to the kids who've been, you know, whose parents' country has been annihilated or damaged or whatever. And I'm writing to Americans, because the definition of American is ever changing. So, yeah.
So I it's interesting you said that, because I remember when we moved here in 83, 82. Well, we first moved to Denver, which I don't recommend as like a place to land. Many years ago, as a first generation Iranian, it's a completely interesting experience. But I remember, like, there was, I think, one Iranian store in this area, and it didn't have everything. And every little thing that we got, there was so much joy and so much reverence for, like, you know, the you know, oh my God, they have somak. Now, like, you go to all the Iranian stores and you're like, please keep the somak to yourself. But, you know, like kuluche, like all these things that you grew up with. And it seemed, and one of the other things that I would love to get your thoughts on is that there's these differences in the generations of Iranian Americans, right? There's those of us who left who thought, I'm never going back. And it was a goodbye, and it was, I've left my heart, my family, you know, I just, you know, it was very,
my husband is like that.
It wasn't moving towards opportunity, it was moving away from something. And then I find that with the green card lotteries and with all of the other things that have happened, then you have newer generations that did really come for opportunity, and not that they weren't moving away from something, but the motivation was a little different. I find us to be very culturally different. And I'm wondering if you've come across the same
That's
thing.
a really interesting question. I think that the generations do differ. The reasons we came are different. I'm not sure that I see the reasons today being that different from the reasons when we came, because of what's going on. But then, you know, in the 90s and the early aughts, before 2009, you know, I think people really did believe we can change this from within. I mean, I believe that we could, without war and all of that. And maybe we could have if things had been different from the outside, from the outer world. But yeah, I guess some people came just for opportunity. I mean, my dad came just for opportunity. And we kept our ties very strong with Iran. So it wasn't, and maybe that's what's happening with a certain generation. They go back, and despite what's happening there now, they can go back and forth. Yeah, I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, I remember going to a play, and it was a new play, and I was like, I swear, I thought I understood Farsi, but I don't think I do, because there's so many words. The culture has
that,
really,
yeah.
but that's part of it.
Yeah.
Linguistically, our heritage has changed. Our relationship with each
in
other has
America.
changed.
It's
True.
everywhere.
True.
You know?
That's a really good point. So I'm gonna just paying attention to our time. We've already talked a bit, and I can talk forever, but I do wanna pause.
Okay.
And I want to open it up
Yeah.
to everyone that's here and make this more of a dialogue and a conversation amongst
Please.
all of us. So, with that, why don't we open it up? Go ahead.
So first, thank you for talking to us.
And thank you for reading my book.
Of course. I'm going to phrase my question in a way that won't have any plot spoilers, but
Okay.
I'm curious about your decision to end the book the way that you did. There are a lot of dynamics and conflicts that have relative closure at the end, but then there's a lot that's kind of left to be determined. So I'm curious if you debated how to end the book, and if you thought about ending it differently, having maybe a few more specific answers, or if you thought that this was just the natural
It's a
end.
really good question, and I'll try to answer it without spoilers. The best way to get an answer for real is to have a book group, and I'll talk to them if you want. That's what we usually talk about, is the ending, especially. But I think the use of the imagination by the reader is my job to elicit, because I don't think we imagine enough these days. And I think that when a story is all wrapped up at the end, it doesn't give you enough to hold on to. So I don't like to resolve everything. And truly, I could go, I could go on and on and on. It could be, there's never really an ending for anybody's character unless they die. And then they're the people left. So but I did have issues about where I was going to end. What exactly was I going to do? And I can talk to you about those. But the whole idea is to make you feel somehow tied and knowing these characters, so that you can sort of think about what could happen with them. Because I think we know now that reading novels helps. Why does it help us avoid dementia? Because it forces our brains to work on many different levels, and we can understand so many other things besides just information. Sorry, sometimes I go on and on.
No, that was perfect.
Yes.
Thank you so much for your book. I really
thank
appreciate it,
you.
especially as someone who also has an Iranian father and an American mother.
Okay.
And I also read The Good Daughter by Jasmine Darzik. I met with her, so
yes.
it was
Jasmine's
really,
a
really
good
wonderful
friend.
to have this. I have not finished it.
Okay,
I'm about
then I won't-
60% of the way through.
Okay.
But I feel like there's a moment of redemption that Mitra is about to experience where I'm at. And I was kind of curious if you could talk a little bit about what redemption means to you, and also redemption in the sense of her relationship to the daughter, but also I think cultural redemption when I think about Julian as well.
Yeah. So redemption is, in my mind, if you're writing fiction as realism, is super important. Actually, in any fiction, I think, because characters. It's not a good idea to have just a super evil character and a super perfect character. Every character, like a real person, has many flaws, and some of the flaws will get resolved, and some won't. But every single character needs to experience change. And one of the ways you do that is with plot. So the fact that there's this horrible tragedy at the beginning of this book is what allows so many of these characters to change in ways they might not have. And by changing, I mean sometimes redemption. So I think it's really important. As far as the cultural redemption is concerned, I'm not sure I know what you mean by that.
I think in the sense of there's always loss.
Mhm.
I think even as an Iranian-American, I feel that there's a loss of your, like, of
Heritage.
that country, yes. And, like, I think even loss, I think, for that first generation who came here, so that kind of, and I think coming to terms with the political unrest, coming to terms with, the violence that we're
Yes.
seeing,
Yeah.
and that the story isn't ending well
Yeah,
when when you turn on the news, that kind of,
I
and
understand.
but still having in your heart that
Right.
love for your culture.
Yeah, it's so hard, I remember during the hostage crisis how terribly hard it was. I mean, you and I are lucky because we don't look brown. And so it was really easy for me to proclaim myself half Iranian, and not worry, because blue eyes, white skin, no accent, and I would just, let people know what I thought and how ridiculous they were being about demonizing Iran. But not everybody has that option. And it took me years to understand that. I think that what's really important is that we remember, and I think novels do this, story does this, rather than the news or social media or whatever. They don't give you a binary answer or a binary choice in every topic. There are terrible things happening in Iran. There are beautiful things happening in Iran. There are terrible things happening in the US, and there are beautiful things happening. So it's just like every person has beautiful and terrible things about them. And we don't have to come down on one side or another. Yes, for good and, for what we think is right, yes, I understand all of that. But culturally, we can own it. And there's another issue in there, because Julian is unaware of his heritage completely. I mean, because he didn't know his father, and his father was Iranian. But he feels, he knows, he senses, because he wants to, and he should be allowed to feel that. No other Iranian should have to tell him you're not Iranian enough, right? If you feel Iranian, if you identify, then you get to be that. And I don't like it when people sort of say to me, well, you're an American girl. I hated that.
So while it's interesting that you touched on that, because I think, I would love to spend a little bit of time talking about, that's really what's fascinating, is that you do create this kaleidoscope of different ways
Oh, I like that word.
of being Iranian and what that can mean, and identity. It's like really saying, the traditional, the not traditional, the privilege, because I would argue Mitra
Whoa.
has a huge amount of privilege. The accidental, for lack of a better word. And I think that's a really interesting way of approaching nuance in our thinking of what an Iranian is and isn't. And I'm wondering why you chose to give Julian the identity of his father being Iranian.
I made that decision probably in 2006.
Wow.
So, or 7. I don't remember. I mean, I'm trying to be honest. I'm trying to think why I did that. I think what I really wanted, I mean, his mother and him were a bigger character before.
Okay.
So I had their backstory, because that's what I do. I create the characters and I give them a backstory. And then sometimes their backstory ends up in the book and sometimes not. And in this book, Julian and his mother's backstory ends up in one interlude.
Yeah.
Which is actually a pretty funny interlude. I can read it if
That
you
would
want.
be great.
Yeah, I can read it.
Yeah,
So,
that would be great.
So, and then you'll get an idea of, if I can find it. Julie, oh, it's right there. So that's weird. Okay, so this starts part 2 of the book, and this is an interlude again. In the time of our history, when hippie love bloomed in San Francisco, when the Kurds of Iran revolted once again, and when Britain's Twiggy wore paper clothing, a young British Red Cross nurse, at the pinnacle of her beauty and the nadir of her pragmatism, was captivated by a dark and striking physician from a faraway place she knew as Persia. They married in London, and he took her to live with him in Tehran, where she was soon disappointed to discover that the people of his country were not as impoverished and downtrodden as she'd anticipated. In fact, his family, which was more populated than the North Country village where the nurse was raised, lived a thoroughly modern life and demanded that she do the same. A doctor's wife, what could be better? There would be no work with the Red Lion and Sun in the poor villages of Persia, no nursing of the tribal sick, only the privilege of making babies and raising them, throwing parties and swimming at the country club. So frustrating. The third world was a bus ride away and yet forbidden to her. And so she left the handsome doctor, who seemed much less handsome now, freeing him to marry a more culturally appropriate woman. Mistakes happen. Caught early, mistakes can be erased. That she kept the birth of their son some months later in England undisclosed was, in her mind, for the best. The boy grew up in the loving circle of his grandparents and mother when she was not fulfilling her pledge to minister to the sick and starving hordes of the third world in far-flung refugee camps. She told him little about his father, and when her ex-husband was killed by one of Saddam's bombs in a military hospital during the war many years later, she was doubly glad of her decision. When the boy grew old enough, she took him with her to experience his chosen future as a physician, but the hardships and strife of camp life were not for him, and he struck out to make a life for himself in the west of the Western world. So now I know why, my answer to your question. Thank you. I wanted to show that time period, the 60s, late 60s, early 70s of Iran, and how, again, there's diversity there. And also the cultural bias and prejudice and lack of understanding of the Western world, thinking that Persia was this place where everybody was poor and she was going to go and whatever, So that's why I put that in there.
The other thing is she's another one of your moms. She's
Yes,
another
she is.
mother.
Yeah.
Very different.
Very different, not very engaged as a mother.
And in some ways, this is portraits of different mothers.
Yeah, you're right, it is. Yeah.
It's just kind of looking at it from that
It's true.
different perspective.
I miss my mom. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad mine is here.
Yeah.
Any other yes?
Hi, Susanne.
Hi, Sibaju.
I was going to ask you, so you mentioned something about a few chapters or area where the publisher decided, one is enough, or at least suggested that, or told you to take out some stuff. If you didn't have any sort of constrict, like the publisher, there was no publisher, say it was just you.
Right.
How would your book have been different? Would it have been longer? Would it have been shorter? And would you have taken it in a different direction, or just
I'm
just
sure.
the essence of it?
Yeah, I'm sure I would have. I mean, I wrote it over 10 years and then it took 5 years to sell. So during those 5 years, I was revising and trying to, make it so that it would be saleable. And so I worked with an outside editor, and I worked with my agent. And so tons of pages were taken out, many storylines. I must have, I sent 7 versions of this novel to my first editor. That was in 2016. And it was 1,100 pages.
Oh.
So, I don't believe in, I wouldn't have written the book that long,
Yeah.
obviously. But my intention was at that time also that this might be a trilogy, and I'm still thinking that it might be. I'm not saying that it will, but, so yes, it was a struggle. The revision process is always a struggle. It was with my first book too. I write long and then I have to revise. So every chapter, every page gets at least 20 revisions, at least. Yeah. So.
So if you were going to do a trilogy, which you may or may not do, and you're
Yes.
not committing to in any way whatsoever.
I do. You're so cute, Termeh. I love it.
Would you be going back or would you be going forward?
Both.
Interesting.
Zoya and Olga,
Okay.
I think.
Fascinating.
Don't hold me to that.
You heard it? No. I want to, again, I want to make sure. Any other questions that? One of the.
Question.
Oh, yes.
Well, it just struck me when you said trilogy, and I was like, this would really be a good movie.
Be a great limited
Because you're
series.
so-
If you know anybody, please.
You have so many interesting, colorful characters.
I
and
agree.
It really, I think it has a little.
Well, if somebody in Hollywood wants to do it, that would be great. Yes. What? Oh, I'm sorry. You should be.
No, please.
But thank you.
My question was about the audio book that, the other day Roya just played a little.
Yes.
And I recognized the voice of the person she had actually narrated the stationery store.
Yes, she did.
Were you involved in that process?
All I did in that process was say, I want her.
Oh,
Yeah.
she has a great voice.
Yeah, she has a really good voice, and she'd done a few other books and she's an avid reader, and I wanted somebody who loved fiction.
So you actually
but-
proposed her name.
I'm sorry?
You actually proposed her name.
I proposed her name, and why am I forgetting? Mojan Marno is her name. She actually was recently in Fleischman is in Trouble. Yeah, she played the woman he has the affair with. Yeah, who was married to the Tucker Carlson count. Yeah. Yeah, and she was in.
good with the accents.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, I haven't listened to the whole thing, but that's what I want. I said I really want an Iranian-American, somebody who can do the accents properly, because I can't bear to hear.
Even Julian.
She did. Oh, she did. Oh, I have to go listen. I haven't had the chance.
Scottish
to do
accent. Yeah.
I have a question, and thank you so much. What a fun person you are, in addition
Oh,
to writing
you.
such an intricate novel. I wanted to know, as a non-Iranian in this room, I'm Armenian, but also of mixed heritage. My
Yes.
mother married into Armenian culture, and a lot of similarities.
Right.
Actually.
Oh, so many.
But and you of course touched upon the fact that it's for any immigrant. Like you wrote, your
Yeah.
audience is much
Yeah.
bigger than
Yeah.
Iranian or Iranian-American. What was the feedback of some of your non-Iranian audience? Because I personally, I could just exchange Iranian for Armenian, and I could hear
Yeah, I
the
know.
conversation. I could identify with it. I could smell the food. There were some details. I actually was fascinated by intricate details and just descriptions. For example, I actually told
tell
Termeh,
me.
it's when the relationship between the refugee family and Mitra and Julian was fascinating to me.
Yeah.
And when especially mother started taking over and cleaning her counters, I could smell them and I could visualize when you said something like, Mitra noticed when she cleaned her counters, it was like cleaning with just water without
Yeah.
like the actual
Yeah.
agent. And I was like, oh, I know.
I know.
my non-Armenian mother, who adopted Armenian culture, would never let me clean it that way, right? But what was the reaction of your non-Iranian audience?
So far, I'm so happy, but the reaction has been really, like they say, exactly what you say. So I'm in San Francisco, so we have a large Asian American population. And yeah, they all relate to it in that sort of like immigrant way. You know, their parents are immigrants and it's the same.
Mhm.
It's, I mean, not the same, but it's, you know, they relate. So I'm hoping more and more will do that. And also, I'm hoping for the Latino community as well, because I have two Latina sisters-in-law. I hope they translate it into Spanish.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so, yeah, because they experience exactly the same stuff
Mhm.
as we do.
Interesting.
Hi, I'm the cousin, by the way.
Yeah, the cousin, she's the cousin, she's the cousin.
But, one thing that was really interesting for me, Susanne, and I told you that too, was that I couldn't believe when I was reading, and I got to the part that, and it's not, I'm not gonna spoil this one, that basically described what is going on right now in Iran, but it was like you wrote this book like so many years ago, and it was so clear to me. I said, my goodness, how did Susanne know this? It was just like, the imagery is just so perfect. And how did you do that?
I don't think, Roya June, but I mean, you're so kind. I don't think what's happening in Iran today is new. I think, first of all, if you look at Persian culture going way back, before the Arab invasion, men and women had the right to own property, the right to hold political office, the right to work, women and men in ancient Persian culture had some sort of an equality with men. And then, of course, the Arab invasion, blah, blah, blah. But since 1905, there was a very strong women's movement in Iran that started in Tabriz. And it continued until the revolution. So my idea that the way this regime falls is little by little, every woman takes her hijab
That
off.
was just so
And,
amazing.
I wrote that before, but I don't think it was prescient of me. I think it would be natural. I mean, it was just like I was waiting for it. The more who do it, and the more men who support them, because that's the hallmark of this regime.
I got chills. When I got to that part, I said, oh my God, I can't believe it. She said
It's
this.
so cute.
And it's happening. And she wrote this book some time ago. I mean, it's
Yeah.
gone through editing and all that.
Yeah,
And
I wrote that in the aughts. It was still like 2010 or something like that when I wrote that. Yeah. So I want people to realize that the fight for women's rights is always present and always will be. And the minute we stop looking and fighting, or at least standing up for, the minute we lose it. In this country too.
And I think that's actually really interesting, because the more and more that we do archaeology, so many civilizations had a different structure.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting that, this concept of patriarchy hasn't always been there.
No, but it's been dominant.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's all having to do with strength of whatever, I guess, and we bear children or whatever the case is. I don't know. I don't know. I just don't want it to be like this all the. And another thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned this, because what you said, Roya, is that I'm very upset that I'm upset when I see Western women looking at Iranian women and feeling sorry for them, as if they need rescuing. Because what I see today happening is that we need to look at them and do what they're doing here and realize that it could get just as bad here if we don't. So I think they are the example right now, even though they're going through hell. They are the example for us.
Yeah, it's cyclical, right? It's
Well, we're all human.
and I think that, the savior complex exists in so many contexts, in so many different places here, so.
Well, also not wanting to accept that your country or your culture is behind the times.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a pride thing.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's very true. Any other thoughts, questions from the audience?
I have a question. I've heard, thank you so much for
Oh, and thank you for coming.
this session. It's so interesting, even though I haven't read the book as of yet. I've heard about audio version of the book.
Yes.
And I was wondering how easy it is to extend, have more audience or readers, especially for the older generation and for disabled person
Yes.
like blind or low vision through the Library of Congress, because
Yes.
a lot of those people like me
Yes.
use still use the digital cassette for
Oh, interesting.
listening to the books.
Okay.
Of
okay.
course, I mean, I have no problem to go to audiobook and listen, but majority of those people, especially
Uh-huh.
the older generation, are not savvy with the
Oh,
computer,
for
and
the-
it's
oh,
not easy for
interesting.
them. That's exactly the conversation that I had yesterday with American Council of Blind
Oh, okay.
regarding the older generation.
Yes.
And, you know.
That's very
Struggling.
interesting because it is available in audio on all the library, and in fact, it's going to be chosen as the book club or the second quarter book club for Hoopla, which is the largest public library digital platform. So public libraries will be able to, you'll be able to listen to it through there, but you're right, it's not, I don't even recall it being anything, is anything actually put on CD or cassette these days? I don't
Digital
know.
cassette, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
That's, okay, I'll ask, I mean, I'll inquire about that. I guess the audio company would do it, but whether they do it or not, I
Yeah.
don't know.
Once excuse me, I mean, it was a seminar I was talking and asking about Iranian authors and books. I was told that it depends to them and the lawyers and all this, you know.
Right,
Maillards,
oh, really?
yeah.
Okay,
to
okay.
I mean, give the permission.
Oh, really?
Maybe publisher as well
Publisher
could
as
be
well, right.
extending the rights to the
Right.
libraries, so
Right.
it's interesting.
I'll look into
We could
it.
examine
Thank
I
you.
will definitely
Yeah.
look into it,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
the rights, I don't own, well, that's not true. No, the audiobook is, the rights are owned by the audiobook company, so it depends on what they decide to do with those
Yeah,
audio
the
rights.
platform,
Yeah.
yeah.
But I will inquire about that, thank you for letting me know.
Thank you.
Is your book going to be translated to Farsi?
If it does get translated to Farsi, chances are I won't have any control over it, and, I mean, I don't know. I
Okay.
mean, you mean translated in this country? And
Yeah.
nobody has approached me about that.
How about other languages? Has anybody
So
approached
far, so the London Book Fair is in April, so we'll see. I hope so. My other book was translated into 6 different languages, so I'm hoping. I really want it to be in Spanish. And of course, yeah, any other language is fine with me.
So we want to make sure that we leave some room for people to have some time with you and to have the books that
Yeah.
I'm sure they have,
Okay.
you know, signed. And if anybody would like to, didn't bring their copy, we have copies here.
Great.
So, you know, for sale, so Marjan June can help you with that.
Yeah, buy one for a friend.
Yeah. And I just, can we just say thank you
Thank
to
you.
you for